Okay, as we continue, we're still in chapter 1 of A Call of the Wild. We are looking at the fact that Manuel the gardener is a treacherous man. He uses the excuse of low wages in order to fulfill his love of gambling. In addition, he also uses the excuse of low wages, which we can infer, by stealing Buck from Judge Miller. Okay? And so he is a minor character, but we need him to show what men will do, or anybody will do, when they desire more money, which is a theme of what? Greed, isn't it? Greed. So over here, you're going to put your character several pages over. You're going to put Manuel the gardener. He's a minor character, but he shows a theme right off the bat of greed. And he justifies his low wages to obtain more. So on page 2, I just wrote he loved to gamble. His wages were low. He made an excuse to gamble because his wages were low, we can infer. And we also know he's a thief. He takes the man who pays his paycheck, he takes the man's dog. So we can infer this man will do just about anything to get money and to feed his, if you will, addiction to gambling. In those days, they didn't call things like that addictions like they do today. All right. So now, as he gives the dog to this man, he says, or the other man says, "You might wrap up the goods before you deliver them," the stranger said gruffly, and Manuel doubled a piece of stout rope around Buck's neck under the collar. "Twist it, and you'll choke 'em plenty," said Manuel, and the stranger grunted a ready affirmative. Buck had accepted the rope with quiet dignity, to be sure. It was an unwanted performance, but he had learned to trust in men he knew and to give them credit for a wisdom that outreached his own. But when the ends of the rope were placed in the stranger's hands, he growled menacingly. He had merely intimated his displeasure. In his pride, which is what? Hubris, right? Mark that. Believing that to intimate was to command. But to his surprise, the rope tightened around his neck, shutting off his breath. Because remember, he ruled over his land. This is so new to him. He has no conception of what's happening. In quick rage, he sprang at the man, who met him halfway, grappled him close by the throat, and with a deft twist threw him over on his back. That's some great imagery, isn't it? You can just see the man grabbing him and throwing him. Then the rope tightened mercilessly, I can't even talk, while Buck struggled in a fury, his tongue lolling about of his mouth and his great chest panting futilely. Never in all his life had he been so vilely treated, which means evilly. And never in all his life had he ever been so angry. But his strength ebbed, his eyes glazed, and he knew nothing when the train was flagged and the two men threw him into the baggage car. So this is really the first time he shows anger, which I put here. He gets angry the first time, page 3. His pride is wounded. The next he knew, he was dimly aware that his tongue was hurting and that he was being jolted along in some kind of conveyance. The hoarse shriek of a locomotive whistling a crossing told him where he was. He had traveled too often with the judge not to know the sensation of riding in a baggage car. He opened his eyes, and into them came the unbridled anger of a kidnapped king. Ooh! Unbridled anger of a kidnapped king. He still believes he is king of everything. Okay? So over here on our character chart, lesson 1. Lesson 1 is that he needs to learn to control his anger and his hubris. Buck understood the men and lay down not happy. That's on page 4, which getting to. Okay? So the first thing we need to know, and I highlighted that for me in yellow, because we can infer that he's going to learn more than one lesson. So we want to be able to go back and forth. So for me, yellow. So pick a different color, whatever, to show your lessons. And he needs to learn to control his anger and his hubris. And I put over here on the right, in quotes, kidnapped king, page 3. Okay. The man sprang for his throat, but Buck was too quick for him. His jaws closed on the hand, nor did they relax till his senses were choked out of him once more. Yep, has fits, the man said, hiding his mangled hand from the baggage man who had been attracted by the sounds of struggle. I'm taking him up for the boss to Frisco, which is San Francisco. A crack dog doctor there thinks that he can cure him. What's he going to cure him of? His anger, his lack of submission as a dog. Concerning that night's ride, the man spoke most eloquently for himself in a little shed back of a saloon on the San Francisco waterfront. All I get is $50 for it, he grumbled, and I wouldn't do it over for 1,000 cold cash, which infers that Buck is completely vicious, something he's never done, and he really hurt that man's hand. His hand was wrapped in a bloody handkerchief, and the right trouser leg was ripped from knee to ankle. How much did the other mug get? The saloon keeper demanded. 100 was the reply. Wouldn't take a so less, so help me. That makes 150, the saloon keeper calculated, and he's worth it, or I'm squarehead. And meaning he's worth it, they're taking him to be a sled dog, so they need strong, powerful dogs to survive. The kidnapper undid the bloody wrappings and looked at his lacerated hand. Well, if I don't get the hydrophoby. Okay. And then he goes on, and they laugh and make a joke. So here we go. Dazed, suffering intolerable pain from throat and tongue, with the life half throttled out of him, Buck attempted to face his tormentors. But he was thrown down and choked repeatedly. So here's my green for his character. And I can infer that his character is still not submitting. Till they succeeded in filing the heavy brass collar from off his neck, then the rope was removed and he was flung into a cage-like crate. There he lay for the remainder of the weary night, nursing his wrath and wounded pride. His pride, hubris. He could not understand what it all meant. What did they want with him, these strange men? Why were they keeping him pent up in this narrow crate? He did not know why, but he felt oppressed by the vague sense of impending calamity. So here we have the technique of foreshadow. It foreshadows trouble. It tells us right here, impending, what's to come, calamity. Several times during the night, he sprang up to his feet when the shed door rattled open, expecting to see the judge, or the boys at least. But each time it was the bulging face of the saloon keeper that peered in at him by the sickly light of a tallow candle. And each time the joyful bark that trembled in Buck's throat was twisted into a savage growl. Okay, mark that word savage. What does that mean? What do we see that's being transformed here? His anger, he is now becoming primal or savage. All of this is coming out in the beginning, because remember the title of this first one, Into the Primitive, right? So we see that first instinct that he doesn't even know that's happening. He is becoming primal. Here we are. But the saloon keeper let him alone, and in the morning 4 men entered and picked up the crate. More tormentors, Buck decided, for they were evil-looking creatures, ragged and unkempt, and he stormed and raged at them through the bars. They only laughed and poked sticks at him, which he promptly assailed with his teeth till he realized that that was what they wanted. Whereupon he laid down sullenly and allowed the crate to be lifted into a wagon. Then he and the crate in which he was imprisoned began a passage through many hands. Clerks in the express office took charge of him. He was carted about in another wagon. A truck carried him with an assortment of boxes and parcels upon a ferry, etc. So right here what we know is he understands the men, and he lays down, but he's not happy. So on the outward, he's surrendering right now, isn't he? But inside, he is raging. For 2 days and nights, this express car was dragged along at the tail of a shrinking locomotive, and for 2 days and nights, Buck neither ate nor drank. In his anger, he had met the first advances of the express messengers with growls, and they had retaliated by teasing him. When he flung himself against the bars, quivering and frothing, they laughed at him and taunted him. They growled and barked like detestable dogs, mewed and flapped their arms and crowed. It was all very silly, he knew, but therefore the more outrage to his dignity and his anger waxed and waxed. And what that means, again, he's so angry, his pride is so wounded, his dignity and his anger waxed and waxed, which means it continues over and over and over. And we see a picture of his anger as getting ready to boil over. He did not mind the hunger so much, but the lack of water caused him severe suffering and fanned his wrath to fever pitch. So we can infer he is getting ready to lose control in some way. For that matter, high-strung and finely sensitive, the ill treatment had flung him into a fever, which was fed by the inflammation of his parched and swollen throat and tongue. He was glad for one thing: the rope was off his neck. They had given them an unfair advantage, but now that the rope was off, he would show them. They would never get another rope around his neck. Upon that, he was resolved. Okay, so what I put down here on your character chart, he'll show them. Page 5, his anger, which I mentioned, has become primal and savage, but he is still with his hubris, right? He'll show them. He has not gotten it, the fact that these men are over him. He doesn't get it. Now, if we come over here, well, before we do that, we'll finish right here. For 2 days and nights he neither ate nor drank, and during those 2 days and nights of torment he accumulated a fund of wrath. So London has used the word wrath twice that we know, and we see the buildup of this anger that boded ill for whoever first fell foul of him. His eyes turned bloodshot, and he was metamorphosed into a raging fiend. Whew. So changed was he that the judge himself would not have recognized him, and the express messengers breathed with relief when they bundled him off the train at Seattle. 4 men gingerly carried the crate from the wagon into a small, high-walled backyard. A stout man with a red sweater that sagged generously at the neck came out and signed the book for the driver. That was the man Buck divined, the next tormentor, and he hurled himself savagely against the bars. So we have seen the word savage used twice, and wrath. The man smiled grimly, and he brought a hatchet and a club. "You ain't going to take him out now?" the driver asked. "Sure," the man replied, driving the hatchet into the crate for a pry. There was an instantaneous scattering of the 4 men who had carried it in, and from safe perches on top the wall they prepared to watch the performance. So, we can infer that this man with the red sweater is going to subdue Buck's pride, right? We can see that. And London uses the red sweater as imagery, color imagery. The color red, look at that right underneath the red sweater. And now he says, now you red-eyed devil, he says to Buck. So when we think of red, yes, we can think of passion and love, right? But we also know that it means the devil, right? The red and the devil and the pitchfork, and also means evil and murder and blood. So that is significant right here about the character that this man is. We can infer that this man is, well, just doing his job, I guess, but really, do you have to just beat him to death? But in our day and age, we don't really understand that, do we? To us, it's animal cruelty, I think. There's certainly got to be a better way to do that. But nonetheless, London wants us to show, again, the contrast between good and evil, between pride and submission. Are y'all following? And so he says, Buck rushed at the splintering wood, sinking his teeth into it, surging and wrestling with it. Wherever the hatchet fell on the outside, he was there on the inside, snarling and growling, as furiously anxious to get out as the man in the red sweater was calmly intent on getting him out.